The vibrant hues of Chlorophyllia's atmosphere shimmered against the sleek hull of the Starlight Venture as it descended through the planet's upper atmosphere. A kaleidoscope of colors danced across the sky, as if the planet itself was alive, pulsing with energy. Johnson Sterling watched from the cockpit, his breath catching in his throat. Chlorophyllia was unlike anything he had ever seen a living, breathing tapestry of bioluminescent flora and vibrant landscapes. This was a world where nature had intertwined with technology in ways humanity could only dream of. But for all its beauty, there was a palpable sense of foreboding as the craft neared the planet's surface. Johnson was a man accustomed to the unknown. As an explorer and diplomat, he had ventured to the farthest reaches of space, encountered species whose very existence challenged human understanding, and navigated the delicate intricacies of interstellar politics. But nothing had quite prepared him for Chlorophyllia, a world known for its hostility toward outsiders, particularly humans. His mission was clear: to establish peaceful relations between Earth and Chlorophyllia, to be the bridge between two worlds that had long viewed each other with suspicion and disdain. But as the ship's landing gear engaged with a soft thud, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to walk into the lion's den. The landing bay was a stark contrast to the vibrant landscapes outside. It was cold, sterile, and unwelcoming. The walls were lined with sleek, silver panels that reflected the harsh, white lights above. Chlorophyllia's technology was impressive, but there was an edge to it, an efficiency born out of necessity, and a deep-seated wariness of outsiders. Johnson disembarked, his polished black boots echoing off the metallic floor. The air was thick with an unfamiliar scent, a mix of earth and something he couldn't quite place, something almost electric. He adjusted the collar of his uniform, the insignia of Earth's diplomatic corps, glinting under the artificial lights. As he took his first steps on Chlorophyllia soil, he was immediately struck by the silence. There was no bustling of workers, no chatter of voices, just the steady hum of machinery and the occasional flicker of lights overhead. It wasn't long before he was surrounded by a group of Chlorophyllia security officers. They were tall, slender beings with elongated limbs and smooth, emerald skin that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Their eyes, large and almond-shaped, were a deep, reflective silver, betraying no emotion. They moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and unnerving. "Identify yourself," one of them demanded, his voice low and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. "Johnson Sterling, Earth's diplomatic envoy," Johnson replied, holding up his identification module. His voice was steady, though his heart was beginning to race. He knew the protocols, the procedures, but nothing could prepare him for the reality of standing before a species that viewed him as little more than a pest. The officer examined the module with a skeptical eye, the silver orbs flicking over the data before handing it back. "Follow us," he said curtly, turning on his heel without another word. Johnson complied, his mind racing as he followed the security team through the labyrinthine corridors of the facility. The walls seemed to close in around him, their sterile sheen reflecting his anxious expression back at him. Every step felt like it echoed louder than the last, as if the very structure of the building was amplifying his presence, reminding him that he was an outsider, an intruder in a world that did not welcome him. After what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a set of massive, double doors. The lead officer placed his hand on a biometric scanner, and with a soft hiss, the doors slid open to reveal a large, circular chamber. The room was dominated by a single, imposing figure standing at its center, her back turned to them as she studied a holographic display suspended in the air before her. "Commander Lilith," the officer announced, his voice breaking the heavy silence that hung in the air. The figure turned, and Johnson found himself face to face with Lilith, the notorious security chief of Chlorophyllia. She was tall, even by Chlorophyllia standards, with a lithe, muscular build that spoke of both strength and precision. Her skin, a deep forest green, shimmered slightly under the chamber's lights, and her eyes, those same cold, silver eyes that all Chlorophyllia natives possessed, fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "So this is the human," she said, her voice low and smooth, but with an unmistakable edge. It was a voice that commanded respect, one that brooked no argument. Johnson forced himself to meet her gaze, despite the discomfort it caused. "Johnson Sterling, at your service," he said with a slight nod, trying to maintain an air of professionalism. Lilith's eyes narrowed slightly as she took him in, her gaze sweeping over him like a predator sizing up its prey. "I've heard much about your kind," she said slowly, her tone laced with disdain. "Filthy animals driven by greed and destruction. What makes you think you can waltz onto our planet and expect anything different?" Johnson felt a flash of anger but quickly suppressed it. He had expected hostility, but the venom in her words was sharper than he had anticipated. "I'm here to build bridges, not burn them," he replied evenly. "I believe our species have more in common than you might think." A humorless smile tugged at the corners of Lilith's lips. "Is that so? We'll see about that." She turned her back on him, her attention returning to the holographic display. "Take him to the detention center," she ordered the officers without another glance in his direction. The officers moved to comply, and Johnson felt a hand clamp down on his arm, not roughly, but with enough force to remind him of his precarious position. As they led him away, he couldn't help but glance back at Lilith, who remained as still as a statue, her focus entirely on the data before her. The walk to the detention center was a blur. Johnson's thoughts were a whirlwind of calculations and reflections, trying to piece together how to navigate the challenges ahead. His mission was more than just diplomatic, it was personal. He had to prove that humanity was capable of more than destruction and exploitation, that they could be partners, friends, even allies. But as he was ushered into a small, stark cell with nothing but a narrow cot and a dim light overhead, the weight of the task ahead settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The door slid shut behind him with a soft click, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the facility's systems. He sat on the edge of the cot, running a hand through his hair as he considered his next move. He needed to get out of this cell, to start making connections, to find a way to prove his worth. But for now, all he could do was wait. Hours passed in a slow, agonizing crawl. Johnson had no way of telling time, but he felt each minute drag on like an eternity. He had been in worse situations, he reminded himself. He had faced down hostile aliens, survived treacherous landscapes, and negotiated peace deals on the brink of war. But something about this place, the cold indifference, the underlying hostility, gnawed at him in a way nothing else had. Just as he was beginning to doze off, the door to his cell hissed open. Johnson jolted awake, blinking against the sudden influx of light. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and slender like the others, but there was something different about this one. "Get up," the figure ordered, her voice sharp but not unkind. As she stepped into the light, Johnson saw that it was a chlorophilia female, younger than Lilith, but with the same determined set to her jaw. Her skin was a lighter shade of green, almost olive, and her eyes, while still the familiar silver, held a curiosity that the others had lacked. "Who are you?" Johnson asked, standing slowly. "Alita," she replied briskly, her gaze appraising him with interest. "I'm Dr. Marita's assistant. She wants to see you." Johnson nodded, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. This could be the opportunity he had been waiting for, a chance to start building those bridges, to show that he was more than just the sum of Lilith's prejudices. As he followed Alita out of the cell and through the facility's winding corridors, he couldn't help but notice the way she occasionally glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, as if trying to reconcile the story she had heard with the man walking beside her. They arrived at a large laboratory filled with an array of alien equipment that Johnson could only guess at the purpose of. At the center of the room was Dr. Marita, an imposing figure with deep green skin and sharp, angular features. Her eyes were the same silver as the others, but they were softened by a layer of deep intellectual curiosity. "Mr. Sterling," she said without looking up from the console she was working on, "I've heard much about you." "Not all good?" "I imagine," Johnson replied with a wry smile. Marita finally looked up, a small smile playing on her lips. "Indeed, but I prefer to form my own opinions." She gestured to a chair across from her. "Sit, we have much to discuss." As Johnson took a seat, he felt the weight of Marita's gaze on him, assessing, analyzing. "You've caused quite a stir by coming here, you know," she said after a moment. "There are those who believe your presence is a threat to our way of life." "I'm here to prove otherwise," Johnson replied. "I believe our species have a lot to learn from each other." Marita's eyes flickered with interest. "That remains to be seen. But I will give you the benefit of the doubt for now. We'll start with some basic tests. I need to understand what makes you tick, Mr. Sterling. Physically, psychologically, culturally, everything." Johnson nodded, knowing this was a crucial step in gaining her trust. I'm an open book, Dr. Morita. She raised an eyebrow. We'll see about that. As the test began, Johnson couldn't help but notice the way Alita watched him from the sidelines, her expression thoughtful, almost intrigued. He made a mental note to engage her later, to find out what she thought of him if he could win her over. It might be the first crack in the wall of prejudice that surrounded him. The tests were grueling, both physically and mentally. Morita was thorough, her questions probing into every aspect of his life, his culture, his beliefs. But Johnson answered them all with patience and honesty, determined to show that he had nothing to hide. Hours passed, and by the time Morita finally called a halt, Johnson was exhausted. "You're an interesting specimen, Mr. Sterling," she said, a note of genuine curiosity in her voice. "Far more complex than I anticipated." "I'll take that as a compliment," Johnson replied, managing a tired smile. Morita nodded, though there was still a cautious distance in her demeanor. "You may return to your cell for now. I need to analyze the data. But we will speak again." Johnson stood, resisting the urge to stretch his aching muscles. "Thank you, Dr. Morita. I appreciate your open-mindedness." Morita merely nodded, already engrossed in the data on her console. Alita stepped forward to escort him back, and as they walked, Johnson noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, less formal, more inquisitive. "You did well in there," Alita said quietly as they approached his cell. "Dr. Morita is not easily impressed." Johnson glanced at her, catching the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. "Thank you, Alita. I'm just trying to show that I'm here in good faith." "I can see that," she replied, her voice softer now. "Not everyone will, though. You should be careful." Johnson nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I appreciate the advice." As he stepped back into his cell, the door sliding shut behind him, Johnson allowed himself a moment of reflection. The road ahead was long and filled with obstacles, but for the first time since arriving on Chlorophylia, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had made his first connection, however tenuous, and that was the first step in proving that humanity was worth more than the prejudice that surrounded them. He lay down on the narrow cot, his mind racing with possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Johnson Sterling was not a man easily deterred. He was determined to succeed, to change the narrative, and to show the people of Chlorophylia that there was more to humanity than met the eye. And as he drifted off to sleep, the last image in his mind was of Lilith, her cold eyes filled with disdain, yet somehow, in the depth of those silver pools, he had seen a flicker of something else, something that made him believe that even the most hardened hearts could be softened. It was a small victory, but one he would build upon, step by step, until the walls of prejudice crumbled and a new era of understanding began. The sterile confines of the Chlorophylia Detention Center became both a refuge and a prison for Johnson Sterling in the days that followed. The cold, unfeeling walls and the constant hum of the facility's systems were a stark contrast to the vibrant world outside, a world he had only glimpsed through the ship's viewport and the narrow windows of his cell. Each day bled into the next, the monotony broken only by the occasional visit from Dr. Morita and her assistant, Alita. Johnson had quickly learned that the Chlorophylia natives, despite their advanced technology and seemingly enlightened society, harbored deep-seated prejudices against humans. It was a prejudice that ran deep, woven into the very fabric of their culture, and it was clear that changing their minds would be no easy task. The days began with a strict routine. Johnson was awoken early by the blaring of a mechanical alarm, the sound grating against his senses. Breakfast, if it could be called, that was a bland, nutrient-rich paste delivered through a slot in the wall. It was functional, designed to keep him alive, nothing more. There was no human touch, no warmth in the act of providing sustenance. He was simply another organism being kept alive for study. After breakfast, he was escorted to the lab by Alita, who had become his primary point of contact. The young Chlorophylia woman was an enigma. Her curiosity about Johnson was evident, but there was also a distance in her demeanor, as if she was constantly weighing the risks of getting too close. He could see the battle playing out behind her silver eyes, a mix of fascination and the deeply ingrained suspicion that all Chlorophylia seemed to hold toward his kind. Dr. Morita, on the other hand, was methodical and detached. She treated Johnson like a specimen, probing him with questions, conducting tests, and analyzing his every move. There was no malice in her actions, but neither was there any warmth. She was a scientist first and foremost, driven by the pursuit of knowledge, and Johnson was merely the subject of her latest experiment. One morning, after yet another round of physical tests, Dr. Morita finally broke the silence that had settled between them. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice as cool and precise as always, "you have been compliant and cooperative during these past few days. I appreciate that. However, I must ask, why are you here? What do you hope to gain from this mission?" Johnson looked at her, surprised by the directness of the question. He had expected more tests, more clinical detachment, but this felt different. This felt personal. "I'm here because I believe in the potential for our species to coexist," Johnson replied, choosing his words carefully. "There's so much we can learn from each other, so much we can achieve together, but that can only happen if we're willing to set aside our prejudices and see each other as equals." Morita's eyes narrowed slightly as she considered his words. "And you think that is possible? After everything your species has done, your wars, your destruction of ecosystems, your history of conquest?" Johnson sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had heard these arguments before, not just from chlorophilia but from other species humanity had encountered. "I won't deny our past," he said, meeting her gaze with unwavering resolve. "Humanity has made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But we've also learned, grown, and changed. We're not the same species we were 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago. We're capable of so much more compassion, cooperation, growth. That's what I'm here to prove." Morita studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally she nodded, though it was unclear if she was convinced or simply acknowledging his answer. "We shall see, Mr. Sterling, we shall see." The tests continued, each day blending into the next with a mix of physical challenges, psychological evaluations, and cultural inquiries. Johnson answered every question as honestly as he could, though he often felt like he was walking a tightrope, trying to balance the truth with the need to present humanity in the best possible light. It was during one of these sessions that Alita, who had mostly remained silent during the proceedings, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice tentative but curious, "you mentioned that humanity has changed. How? What brought about this change?" Johnson turned to her, surprised by the question. It was the first time she had engaged with him directly, outside of the formalities of the tests. It wasn't one thing, he replied, choosing his words carefully. It was a combination of factors: advances in technology, shifts in social and political structures, and most importantly, the realization that we couldn't keep going down the path we were on. We had to change, or we would have destroyed ourselves. Alita nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "And do you think that change is permanent, or is it just a matter of time before humanity reverts to its old ways?" Johnson hesitated. It was a fair question, and one that had plagued him on more than one occasion. "I'd like to believe it's permanent," he said finally. "But the truth is, we're still learning. Change is never easy, and it's never guaranteed. But we're trying, and that's what matters." Alita's gaze softened slightly, and for the first time, Johnson saw a glimmer of something other than suspicion in her eyes. Perhaps it was hope, or perhaps it was simply a crack in the armor of prejudice that she, like all chlorophilia natives, had been taught to wear. Dr. Morita, however, remained as inscrutable as ever. She observed the exchange with mild interest before turning back to her console. "That will be all for today, Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone dismissive. "You may return to your cell." Johnson nodded, standing up from the examination chair. "Thank you, Dr. Morita," he said, though he wasn't sure what exactly he was thanking her for: her time, perhaps, or the sliver of humanity she had allowed to peek through her otherwise clinical demeanor. As he left the lab, escorted by Alita, Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The conversations he had had with Morita and Alita, though small in the grand scheme of things, felt like the first steps towards something greater. He wasn't sure what that something was yet, but he knew he had to keep pushing forward. The walk back to his cell was quieter than usual. Alita seemed lost in thought, her gaze fixed ahead as she led the way through the winding corridors. Johnson took the opportunity to study her, noting the way her brow furrowed slightly, the way her lips pressed together as if she was wrestling with something internally. "Alita," he began cautiously, "I can tell you have questions. If there's anything you want to know about me, about humanity, I'm happy to answer." She glanced at him, her expression guarded. "I do have questions," she admitted after a moment, "but I'm not sure if you'll like the answers." Johnson smiled faintly. I'm here to listen, whatever those questions are. Understanding each other is the first step toward building trust. Alita slowed her pace slightly, as if weighing his words. Why do you care so much about what we think of you, she asked finally. Why does it matter to you? Johnson considered her question carefully. Because I've seen what happens when we don't care, he said after a moment. I've seen the damage that ignorance and prejudice can cause, and I don't want that for us, for our species. I want to be better, to do better. And that starts with understanding each other. Alita looked at him, really looked at him, as if searching for any sign of deceit. When she found none, she nodded, her expression softening ever so slightly. I suppose that's fair, she said quietly. But it won't be easy. There are a lot of people here who don't want to see that change. Johnson nodded. I know. But I'm not giving up. I can't give up. They reached his cell, and as the door slid open, Alita hesitated, as if she wanted to say something more. Finally, she simply said, "Good night, Mr. Sterling." "Good night," Alita, Johnson replied, stepping into the cell. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving him alone once more. But this time the solitude didn't feel quite as oppressive. The walls of his cell seemed less confining, the air less stifling. There was still a long road ahead, filled with challenges and obstacles he could only begin to imagine. But there was also hope that the walls of prejudice and suspicion that surrounded him could be broken down, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. As he lay down on the cot, Johnson's thoughts drifted to Lilith, the stern and unyielding security chief who had been so quick to judge him. He knew that winning her over would be the most difficult challenge of all. But if he could reach her, if he could show her that humanity was worth the effort, then maybe, just maybe, he could begin to change the minds of others as well. For now, though, he would take things one step at a time. He had already made progress with Alita, and that was more than he could have hoped for when he first arrived. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Johnson Sterling was ready for them. As he drifted off to sleep, his mind filled with thoughts of the days ahead, he couldn't help but feel a sense of optimism. It was a fragile thing, easily shattered, but it was there, flickering in the darkness like a distant star. And for now, that was enough. The soft, pulsating glow of Chlorophyllia's bioluminescent plants filtered through the high, narrow windows of Johnson's cell, casting an eerie light across the metallic walls. Despite the harshness of his surroundings, there was something calming about the faint, rhythmic light, a reminder of the living world outside this cold, sterile facility. It had been several days since his last in-depth conversation with Dr. Marita and Alita, and while the routine of tests and interrogations had continued, Johnson could sense a subtle shift in the way he was treated. The security guards were no longer as brusque, and Alita had begun to engage him in small talk during their walks to and from the lab. These were small victories, perhaps, but they were victories nonetheless. Johnson had learned to celebrate even the smallest signs of progress, knowing that change often started in the smallest of ways. This morning, however, felt different from the moment the door to his cell slid open. Alita stood there as usual, her expression a mix of professionalism and curiosity, but there was an underlying tension in the way she held herself, an urgency that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," she greeted him, her voice softer than usual. "Good morning," Alita, Johnson replied, studying her carefully as he stepped out into the corridor. "Is everything all right?" Alita hesitated, a brief flicker of uncertainty passing over her features before she nodded. "Yes, Dr. Marita wants to see you again. There's something she wants to discuss with you." Johnson felt a stir of apprehension. Dr. Marita had been thorough in her questioning, relentless in her pursuit of understanding what made him, and by extension humanity, tick. If there was something she needed to discuss outside of their usual sessions, it must be significant. The walk to the lab was unusually quiet. Alita seemed lost in thought, her eyes downcast as she led the way through the winding corridors. Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something that could either propel him forward in his mission or set him back in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. When they arrived at the lab, the atmosphere was tense. Dr. Marita was already there, standing beside a holographic display that showed a complex array of data charts, graphs and symbols that Johnson couldn't make sense of. Her expression was as inscrutable as ever, but there was a tightness around her mouth, a subtle indication that whatever she had to say was of great importance. "Mr. Sterling," she greeted him, her voice clipped but not unkind. Please, sit down. We have much to discuss. Johnson took a seat, his eyes flicking between Marita and Alita, who stood slightly behind her superior, her expression still guarded. Marita activated the display, and the holograms shifted to show a series of images, depictions of Earth, its landscapes, its cities, its people. I've been reviewing the data we've collected from you over the past few weeks, she began, her tone clinical. It's intriguing, to say the least. Your descriptions of human culture, your history, your technological advancements, they paint a picture that is far more complex than the simplistic, destructive species we've always believed you to be. Johnson felt a cautious sense of optimism but kept his expression neutral. I'm glad to hear that, Dr. Marita. Humanity is indeed complex, and I'm here to show that there's more to us than our worst moments. Marita's eyes narrowed slightly as she continued. Be that as it may, there are still many within our society who would prefer to see your kind as little more than a threat. I'm not entirely convinced myself, though I admit your presence here has raised questions that need answers. Johnson leaned forward slightly, sensing an opportunity. And how can I help provide those answers? Marita considered him for a moment before tapping a few commands into the console. The hologram shifted again, this time showing images of various chlorophyllous cities thriving, beautiful places where nature and technology coexisted in harmony. But alongside these images were more troubling ones, scenes of destruction, of conflict, of war. Johnson recognized some of the symbols as those of the Zarians, a warlike race known for their conquests and their ruthless efficiency in battle. Not all of our past interactions with other species have been peaceful, Marita said quietly. We've had to defend ourselves against threats that sought to exploit or destroy us. The Zarians, in particular, have been a constant threat to our existence. They're relentless, and their incursions into our space have grown more frequent. Johnson listened intently, understanding that this was more than just a history lesson. This was context that would shape his actions moving forward. Why are you telling me this? He asked carefully. Because I believe the Zarians are planning another attack, Marita replied, her tone grave. And if that happens, we may need your help. Johnson's heart skipped a beat. This was at the turning point he had been waiting for. An opportunity not only to prove his worth but to demonstrate that humanity could be an ally, not an enemy. What kind of help do you need? He asked, keeping his voice steady. Marita glanced at Alita, who stepped forward, her expression more open than it had been before. We've been working on a defensive weapon, Alita explained, her voice calm but tinged with concern. It's experimental, untested. We're not even sure if it will work, but it's our best chance against the Zarians. Johnson frowned. And you think I can help with this? Marita nodded. Your knowledge of human technology and tactics could be invaluable. You've seen conflicts like this before, and your perspective could offer insights we might not consider. Johnson nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what was being asked of him. This was more than just a mission of diplomacy now, it was a test of his capabilities, of his willingness to put himself in harm's way for a species that had, up until now, treated him with suspicion and disdain. I'll do whatever I can, he said firmly, but I'll need to know more about this weapon and how you plan to use it. Marita gestured to the display, which shifted to show a schematic of a large, complex machine buried deep within a fortified facility. This is the core of our defense system, she explained. It's designed to harness the energy of chlorophylla's unique ecosystem, channeling it into a focused beam capable of neutralizing incoming threats. But as I said, it's experimental. The energy required to power it is immense, and we're not entirely sure it can be controlled. Johnson studied the schematic, his mind racing with possibilities. The technology was unlike anything he had ever seen, yet there were familiar elements, principles of physics and engineering that he could grasp, even if the specifics were beyond him. Have you tested it at all? He asked. Only on a small scale, Alita replied. We've run simulations, but without a real threat to test it against, we can't be certain it will work as intended. Johnson nodded, already forming a plan in his mind. Then we need to conduct a test. A controlled one, to see if we can harness this energy safely. If we can, we'll be better prepared when the Zarians attack. Marita's eyes flicked to Alita, who nodded in agreement. That's what we were hoping you'd say, Marita said. We've already begun preparations. The test is scheduled for tomorrow. Johnson felt a surge of adrenaline. This was happening faster than he had anticipated, but it was an opportunity he couldn't afford to pass up. "I'll need full access to the system schematics," he said. "And I'll need to work closely with your engineers to ensure everything is ready." "You'll have what you need," Marita assured him. "But understand this, Mr. Sterling, if this test fails, it could mean disaster for all of us. There's no room for error." "I understand," Johnson replied, meeting her gaze with unwavering resolve. "I won't let you down." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity. Johnson was given access to the schematics and data he needed, and he spent hours poring over every detail, working with Chlorophyllia's engineers to identify potential weaknesses and solutions. The technology was unlike anything he had ever encountered, but his experience with human systems and tactics allowed him to offer insights that the Chlorophylia team had overlooked. As the hours passed, a sense of camaraderie began to develop between Johnson and the engineers. They were initially wary of his suggestions, but as they saw the value of his input, their attitudes began to shift. By the time they finished their preparations for the test, there was a mutual respect between them, a small but significant step toward bridging the gap between their species. That night, as Johnson lay in his cell, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. Tomorrow would be critical not just for his mission, but for the future of relations between Earth and Chlorophylia. If the test was successful, it could be the breakthrough he needed to prove that humanity was worth trusting, worth allying with. If it failed, well, he didn't want to think about that. He closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep, despite the anxiety gnawing at his gut. He needed to be sharp, focused, ready for whatever challenges the test would bring. But even as he drifted off, his thoughts kept circling back to Lilith, the formidable security chief who had shown him nothing but hostility since his arrival. He hadn't seen her since their initial encounter, but he knew she was watching, waiting for him to slip up. If this test succeeded, it could be the first step toward winning her over. But if it failed, he doubted she would ever give him another chance. The next morning, Johnson was up before dawn, his mind already buzzing with the day's tasks. Alita arrived to escort him to the testing facility, her demeanor more relaxed than usual. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a tension that was palpable as they made their way through the corridors. When they arrived at the facility, Johnson was greeted by the sight of the massive machine he had seen in the schematics. It was even more imposing in person, its sleek, metallic surface gleaming under the harsh lights. The engineers were already hard at work, making final adjustments and running checks on the system. Dr. Marita was there as well, her expression focused and intense as she monitored the preparations. "Mr. Sterling," she greeted him with a nod. "Everything is ready, we're just waiting on your final input." Johnson approached the machine, his mind racing as he took in the array of controls and monitors. He could feel the eyes of the engineers on him, the weight of their expectations heavy on his shoulders. "Let's run through the sequence one more time," he said, his voice calm and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "I want to make sure we've covered every contingency." They went over the plan in meticulous detail, reviewing every step of the test sequence, every potential risk, and how to mitigate it. Johnson's experience in dealing with high-pressure situations proved invaluable, and by the time they were ready to begin the test, there was a sense of cautious optimism in the air. Marita stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the machine. "This is it," she said quietly. "Once we start, there's no turning back." Johnson nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I'm ready." Marita gave the signal, and the room filled with the low hum of the machine powering up. The lights dimmed slightly as the system began to draw energy from the surrounding environment, channeling it into the core of the machine. The air crackled with electricity, the tension in the room palpable as everyone watched the monitors, waiting for the first signs of success or failure. As the energy levels continued to rise, Johnson monitored the readouts closely, his mind racing through potential scenarios. The machine was holding steady, the energy flow stable, but there was still a long way to go before they could declare the test a success. Then, suddenly one of the monitors began to flash red. A warning signal blared through the room, and the engineers sprang into action, their fingers flying over the controls as they tried to stabilize the system. "Energy levels are spiking," one of them shouted. "We're losing control." Johnson's heart raced as he assessed the situation. The machine was drawing more energy than it could handle, and if they didn't find a way to regulate it, the entire system could overload and possibly explode. "Shut down the auxiliary power feed," Johnson ordered, his voice calm but urgent. redirect the excess energy into the secondary conduits. We need to balance the load before it's too late. The engineers scrambled to follow his instructions, their hands moving with practiced precision as they worked to stabilize the system. Johnson watched the monitors intently, his mind calculating every possible outcome, every potential solution. Slowly, the energy levels began to stabilize. The red warning lights flickered off, replaced by a steady green glow that indicated the system was back under control. The room was silent except for the hum of the machine, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Finally, Marita let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "It's holding," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's working." A wave of relief washed over the room as the realization sank in. The test was a success. The machine had stabilized, and the energy had been harnessed as intended. They had done it. Johnson allowed himself a small smile as he met Marita's gaze. "Looks like we're in business," he said, his voice laced with satisfaction. Marita nodded, a rare smile touching her lips. "Indeed we are." The room erupted in a chorus of cheers and congratulations, the engineers clapping each other on the back and exchanging relieved smiles. Johnson felt a surge of pride. This was what he had come here to do, to prove that humanity could contribute something valuable, something that could benefit not just themselves but others as well. As the celebration continued, Johnson's thoughts drifted back to Lilith. He knew this success would reach her ears, that she would hear about the role he had played in stabilizing the system. Whether it would be enough to change her opinion of him remained to be seen, but it was a start he intended to build upon. The rest of the day was a blur of activity as the team debriefed and began making plans for the next phase of their preparations. The Zarian threat loomed large, but now they had a weapon that could potentially turn the tide in their favor. It was a powerful feeling knowing that he had contributed to something so significant. That evening, as Johnson returned to his cell, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why he had come to Chlorophilia, not just to build bridges, but to create something lasting, something that could protect and preserve both their worlds. As he lay down to sleep, his mind buzzed with thoughts of the days ahead. There was still much work to be done, and the threat of the Zarians loomed ever closer. But for now, Johnson allowed himself to savor this moment of triumph, knowing that it was only the beginning. The turning point had come, and Johnson Sterling was ready to meet the challenges that lay ahead, determined to prove that humanity had a place in the future of Chlorophilia, and that together, they could build a future worth fighting for. The skies above Chlorophilia were an ominous shade of violet, streaked with deep crimson as the sun began its slow descent beyond the horizon. The planet's natural beauty, usually a source of wonder and tranquility, was marred by the tension that gripped its inhabitants. Every leaf of the bioluminescent flora seemed to pulse with anxious energy. Every creature in the vast jungles had gone eerily silent, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. In the capital city, where the sleek, organic architecture intertwined with the living environment, a sense of dread permeated the air. The Zarian fleet had been detected at the edges of Chlorophilia's space just hours ago, their warships dark silhouettes against the backdrop of stars. The invasion was imminent, and the people of Chlorophilia, despite their advanced technology and resilient spirits, were afraid. They had faced the Zarians before, and the scars of those encounters were still fresh in their collective memory. But this time was different. This time they had Johnson Sterling. In the heart of the city, deep within the fortified complex that housed Chlorophilia's most advanced technology, Johnson stood before the massive weapon he had helped bring to life. The machine hummed with barely contained energy, its core glowing with the harnessed power of the planet itself. It was a marvel of engineering, a testament to the collaboration between Chlorophilia's greatest minds and the insights Johnson had brought from Earth. It was their last hope. Around him, the control room buzzed with activity. Engineers and scientists worked tirelessly at their stations, running final checks and calibrations, their faces tense but focused. Dr. Marita, ever the embodiment of calm under pressure, was at the helm, directing the efforts with a steady hand. Alita was by her side, her eyes fixed on the monitors, her fingers flying over the controls as she monitored the weapons systems. Johnson felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Lilith standing beside him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a fire in her silver eyes that hadn't been there before, a resolve that mirrored his own. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her voice low and serious. Johnson met her gaze, nodding. "I am." We've done everything we can. Now it's just a matter of execution. Lilith's grip on his shoulder tightened slightly, a rare show of emotion from the usually stoic security chief. I've had my doubts about you, Sterling, she admitted, her voice softening. But you've proven me wrong. I'm glad you're here. Johnson smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest at her words. I'm glad too, Lilith. We're going to get through this together. She nodded, releasing his shoulder and turning her attention back to the monitors. The moment of connection passed, but it left a lingering sense of unity between them, a bond forged in the crucible of crisis. Attention, everyone, Marita's voice rang out, calm but commanding. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. The Zarian fleet will be within range in approximately 20 minutes. This is it. We've run every simulation, every test, but now we need to make it work in the real world. There's no margin for error. Stay focused, stay calm, and follow your instructions to the letter. A murmur of acknowledgement swept through the room as the team steeled themselves for what was to come. Johnson's heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was sharp, his focus unwavering. He had been in high-pressure situations before, but nothing like this, nothing with stakes as high as the survival of an entire planet. Johnson, Marita called, turning to him. You're the key to this. We need your guidance to synchronize the final activation sequence. Are you ready? Johnson stepped forward, taking his place at the central console. I'm ready, he said, his voice steady. Let's do this. The final preparations moved quickly, the team working with a precision born of necessity. Johnson's hands moved over the controls, his mind racing as he guided the energy flow, balancing the power levels, and ensuring the weapon remained stable. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the machinery and the occasional beep of a monitor. Every second felt like an eternity. 10 minutes until the Zarians are in range, Alita reported, her voice tight with tension. Energy levels are stable, Johnson confirmed. We're ready for activation on your mark, Dr. Marita. Marita nodded, her eyes flicking between the monitors and the countdown clock that ticked away on the wall. Prepare for full power activation in 5 minutes, she ordered. This is our one shot. We have to make it count. The room seemed to hold its breath as the final minutes ticked down. Johnson could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. There was no room for doubt, no space for fear. This was what he had come here to do. Zarian ships are entering range, Alita announced, her voice trembling slightly. They're charging weapons. Activate the weapon, Marita commanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Johnson's fingers flew over the controls, initiating the sequence that would unleash the weapon's full power. The core of the machine began to pulse with a blinding light, the energy levels spiking as the system channeled the raw power of Chlorophyllia's ecosystem into a single, devastating beam. Energy levels are holding, Johnson reported, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. We're at full power. Targeting Zarian fleet, Alita confirmed, her eyes locked on the targeting display. We have a lock. Fire, Marita ordered, her voice filled with the gravity of the moment. For a split second, there was nothing but silence. Then, with a roar that shook the very foundation of the facility, the weapon unleashed its energy. A blinding beam of light shot out from the core, piercing through the atmosphere and streaking across the sky like a bolt of divine lightning. The beam struck the Zarian fleet with pinpoint accuracy, the impact so powerful it sent shockwaves rippling through the air. The control room erupted into chaos as alarms blared and monitors flashed red. Johnson's heart leaped into his throat as he watched the energy levels spike dangerously, the system struggling to contain the raw power it had unleashed. Energy overload, one of the engineers shouted, his voice tinged with panic. We're losing control. Johnson's mind raced as he assessed the situation. The weapon had done its job, but now the very thing that had saved them threatened to destroy them. If they didn't stabilize the system, the entire facility and possibly the entire city could be vaporized. Shut down the main reactor, Johnson ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. We need to bleed off the excess energy. The engineers scrambled to follow his instructions, their hands moving with frantic precision as they worked to stabilize the system. Johnson could feel the heat rising in the room, the air crackling with the residual energy that threatened to tear the facility apart. Come on, Johnson muttered under his breath, his fingers flying over the controls as he tried to regain control of the system. The energy levels were still climbing, the core dangerously close to a catastrophic meltdown. "We're not going to make it," Alita cried, her eyes wide with fear. "Yes, we are," Johnson said through gritted teeth, his focus razor-sharp. "We have to." With one final, desperate push, Johnson initiated a manual override, diverting the excess energy into the secondary conduits. For a moment the room was bathed in a blinding light, the heat so intense it felt like the very air was on fire. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, the heat dissipating as the system stabilized. The alarms went silent, the monitors returning to their normal, steady green. "We did it," Marita breathed, her voice filled with disbelief. "We actually did it." The room erupted into cheers, the tension breaking as the team celebrated their victory. Johnson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, a wave of relief washing over him. "We did it," he echoed, a smile spreading across his face as he met Lilith's gaze. She smiled back, a rare, genuine smile that lit up her usually stern features. But the celebration was short-lived. Alita's voice cut through the noise, sharp with urgency. "The Zarians are retreating, but there's something else. Something big." Johnson's heart skipped a beat as he turned to the monitors. The Zarian fleet was in full retreat, their ships limping away from Chlorophyllia's orbit, but something else had appeared on the scanners, a massive energy signature, far larger than anything they had seen before. "What is that?" Marita asked, her voice filled with dread. "It's a Zarian mothership," Alita replied, her voice trembling. "It's powering up for a full-scale attack." A heavy silence fell over the room as the realization sank in. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The Zarian mothership was a behemoth, a fortress of destruction capable of laying waste to entire planets. If it unleashed its full power, Chlorophylla wouldn't stand a chance. Johnson felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach, but he pushed it aside. There had to be a way. They couldn't have come this far just to fail now. "Is there any way we can stop it?" Lilith asked, her voice calm but urgent. Marita shook her head, her expression grim. "Not with the weapon we just used. The energy levels are depleted, and it would take hours to recharge time we don't have." Johnson's mind raced as he considered their options. The mothership was massive, far beyond the capabilities of any single weapon they had. But maybe, just maybe. "What about the planet?" Johnson asked, his voice suddenly filled with a spark of hope. "Can we use Chlorophylla itself to defend against the mothership?" Marita frowned, clearly intrigued by the idea but also wary. "What do you mean?" "Chlorophylla is alive," Johnson explained, his mind racing with possibilities. "The entire planet is a living organism, connected through its ecosystem. If we can tap into that, use the planet's natural defenses, we might be able to disrupt the mothership's systems, maybe even drive it off." "It's never been done before," Marita said, her expression skeptical but considering. "But it's possible, theoretically." Johnson met her gaze, his eyes filled with determination. "It's our only shot. We have to try." Marita hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "All right, let's do it." The team sprang into action, working with a renewed sense of urgency. Johnson and Marita led the effort, coordinating the plan to tap into Chlorophyllia's ecosystem and channel its energy into a defensive grid. The idea was audacious, risky, and entirely unprecedented, but it was their last hope. The minutes ticked by as the team worked feverishly, connecting the systems, calibrating the energy flows, and synchronizing the planet's natural defenses. Johnson could feel the tension in the air, the weight of what they were about to attempt. There was no margin for error. If they failed, Chlorophylla would be lost. "Energy levels are stabilizing," Alita reported, her voice filled with cautious optimism. "We're almost ready." "Zarian mothership is powering up its main weapon," Lilith added, her voice tense. "We have less than 5 minutes." "Engage the planetary defenses," Marita ordered, her voice steady but urgent. "Now." Johnson's fingers moved over the controls, initiating the sequence that would tap into Chlorophylla's ecosystem and channel its energy into a defensive grid. The planet itself seemed to respond, the bioluminescent flora glowing brighter as the energy flowed through the network, converging on the mothership. The room was silent as they watched the monitors, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The energy grid pulsed with light, the power of the planet itself focused into a single, unified force. "Fire," Johnson ordered, his voice filled with the weight of the moment. The energy grid unleashed its power, a wave of light and energy that shot out from the planet's surface and slammed into the Zarian mothership. The ship shuddered under the impact, its systems flickering as the energy disrupted its core. "It's working," Alita cried, her voice filled with exhilaration. "The mothership's systems are destabilizing." Johnson felt a surge of relief, but he knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The mothership was still powering up its main weapon, and if they didn't stop it soon, the entire planet would be at risk. "Divert all remaining energy to the grid," Johnson ordered, his voice calm but urgent. "We need to overload their systems before they can fire." The team worked with frantic precision, redirecting the planet's energy into the grid for one final, desperate push. The room was bathed in the glow of the energy flows, the air crackling with power as the planet itself seemed to come alive. Come on," Johnson muttered under his breath, his eyes fixed on the monitors. Then, with a blinding flash of light, the Zarian mothership's systems overloaded. The ship convulsed under the strain, its hull cracking as the energy grid tore through its core. A deafening explosion shook the facility as the mothership disintegrated in a blaze of fire and light, the remnants of the once mighty ship scattering into the void. The room fell silent, the monitors showing nothing but the empty space where the Zarian mothership had been. The threat was gone, Chlorophylia was safe. "We did it," Marita said, her voice filled with awe and disbelief. "We actually did it." The room erupted into cheers, the team celebrating their hard-won victory. Johnson felt a wave of relief wash over him, his knees almost buckling as the tension of the past hours finally released. Lilith was at his side in an instant, her smile wide and genuine. "You did it, Sterling," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "We couldn't have done it without you." Johnson smiled back, the warmth of her words filling him with a sense of accomplishment. "We did it together," he replied, his voice filled with gratitude. "All of us." As the celebration continued, Johnson allowed himself a moment to step back and take it all in. The people of Chlorophylia, who had once viewed him with suspicion and disdain, were now looking at him with something else: respect, gratitude, even admiration. He had come to this planet to build bridges, and now, standing in the heart of the facility, surrounded by those he had fought alongside, he knew he had succeeded. This was more than just a victory over the Zarians. It was a victory for understanding, for cooperation, for the belief that different species, different worlds, could come together and achieve something greater than they could alone. It was the beginning of a new era, one that Johnson was honored to be a part of. In the days that followed, the people of Chlorophylia began to rebuild, not just their city, but their society. The victory over the Zarians had sparked a new sense of unity, a recognition that they were stronger together than apart. Johnson was officially named a cultural ambassador, a role that would see him continue to work alongside the people of Chlorophylia to forge a lasting partnership between their species. Lilith stood by his side as they watched the sun rise over the city, the first light of a new day casting long shadows across the landscape. The tension of the past weeks had given way to a quiet peace, a sense of hope for the future. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Lilith asked, her voice soft but filled with anticipation. Johnson smiled, his heart light as he looked out at the world he had come to love. "I am," he said simply, "and I'm looking forward to it." Lilith nodded, her hand finding his as they stood together, united by the experiences they had shared, the battles they had fought, and the future they would build together. As the sun rose higher in the sky, bathing the city in golden light, Johnson knew that this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, but he was ready to face them because he knew he wasn't alone. He had found allies, friends, and perhaps even something more on this distant world, and together they would create a future that was bright with possibility. This was the new era he had fought for, and it was just beginning. The soft, golden light of Chlorophyllia's twin suns bathed the capital city in a warm, welcoming glow, casting long shadows across the verdant landscape. The city, once marked by the tension of impending doom, now thrummed with a sense of relief and renewal. The Zarian threat had been vanquished, the scars of battle beginning to heal, and in the aftermath, a new chapter was unfolding, one marked by gratitude, reconciliation, and the promise of a brighter future. Johnson Sterling stood on the balcony of the Chlorophilia Council's Grand Hall, overlooking the bustling streets below. The city was alive with activity as its inhabitants went about the process of rebuilding not just their infrastructure, but the fabric of their society. It was a place transformed, and Johnson could feel the difference in the air. Where once there had been suspicion, distrust, and thinly veiled hostility, there was now a palpable sense of unity, of purpose. And yet, despite the victory and the progress that had been made, Johnson couldn't shake the memories of his arrival on this world, the cold reception, the harsh treatment, and the deeply ingrained prejudices that had colored every interaction. He had come to Chlorophilia as an outsider, a human in a world that saw his kind as little more than barbarians. But now, after everything that had transpired, things had changed. He had earned the respect and gratitude of the people, but the path to reconciliation was still a delicate one. As he stood there, lost in thought, the sound of footsteps behind him pulled him back to the present. He turned to see Alida approaching, a bright smile on her face that had become a more frequent sight in recent days. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," she greeted him warmly, her eyes reflecting the sunlight. "Good morning," Alida Johnson replied with a smile. "How are things progressing?" "Better than we could have hoped," she said, her voice filled with a mix of pride and relief. "The city is recovering quickly, and the council has been working on new policies to promote greater cooperation between our people and yours. Your efforts have not gone unnoticed." Johnson nodded, grateful for the progress but still keenly aware of the work that lay ahead. "That's good to hear. But there's still much to be done, isn't there?" Alida's smile faded slightly, replaced by a more thoughtful expression. "Yes, there is. And that's actually why I'm here. The council has requested your presence at a meeting today. They want to officially express their gratitude and discuss the next steps in our partnership." Johnson raised an eyebrow, surprised by the news. "The council wants to thank me? That's unexpected." Alida nodded, understanding his surprise. "I know it might seem strange given how you were treated when you first arrived. But things have changed, Johnson. The council and the people see you differently now. You've earned their respect, and they want to acknowledge that." Johnson's mind flashed back to his first encounter with the council, the cold, clinical assessments, and the underlying distrust that had permeated the room. It was hard to reconcile that memory with the idea of them now offering gratitude. "I'll be there," Johnson said after a moment, a sense of resolve settling over him. "It's important that we continue to build on the progress we've made." Alida smiled again, a touch of admiration in her eyes. "I knew you'd say that. The meeting is in an hour, so we should head inside." As they walked through the grand hall, Johnson couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the way the Chlorophilia natives treated him. The guards who had once regarded him with suspicion now nodded respectfully as he passed. The staff who managed the building offered him warm smiles, their previous wariness replaced with something resembling friendliness. It was a stark contrast to the cold reception he had received upon his arrival, and it filled Johnson with a sense of hope that perhaps true reconciliation was possible. When they reached the council chamber, Johnson was struck by the change in atmosphere. The room, once filled with tension and distrust, now felt more welcoming. The council members, who had been so quick to judge him before, now looked at him with expressions of respect, even gratitude. Dr. Marita was already seated at the head of the table, her usually stern demeanor softened by a rare smile. "Mr. Sterling," she greeted him as he took his seat. "Thank you for joining us." "It's an honor to be here," Johnson replied, his voice steady as he met her gaze. Marita nodded, her eyes reflecting a depth of emotion that was rarely visible. "We've asked you here today because we believe it's important to formally recognize the role you played in our recent victory and in the future of our world." Johnson inclined his head, grateful for the acknowledgement but eager to move beyond formalities. "I appreciate that, Dr. Marita, but as I've said before, this was a team effort. Everyone here played a critical role in our success." "True," Marita agreed, "but it was your insight, your willingness to share your knowledge, and your determination that made the difference. Without you, I'm not sure we would have succeeded." The other council members murmured their agreement, and Johnson felt a swell of emotion in his chest. These were the same people who had once seen him as a threat, who had questioned his motives at every turn. To hear them speak of him with such respect was both humbling and heartening. "There's something else we need to address," another council member said, his voice hesitant but sincere. It was Councillor Iriat, a tall, slender figure with deep green skin and piercing silver eyes. He had been one of the most vocal opponents of Johnson's presence on Chlorophylia, arguing that humans were too dangerous to be trusted. Now, however, there was a different tone in his voice, a tone of remorse. "When you first arrived, Mr. Sterling, I was..." Less than welcoming, Ariad continued, his eyes meeting Johnson's with an intensity that spoke of deep reflection. "I allowed my prejudices to cloud my judgment, and for that, I owe you an apology." Johnson was taken aback by the admission. Ariad had been one of his harshest critics, and to hear him now, openly admitting his mistake, was both surprising and deeply meaningful. "You don't owe me anything," Counselor Johnson said, his voice gentle but firm. "What's important is that we move forward together, learning from the past and building a better future." Ariad nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're a better man than I gave you credit for, Mr. Sterling. And for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here." The rest of the council echoed Ariad's sentiments, each member taking a moment to express their gratitude, and in some cases, their regret for how they had treated Johnson. It was a powerful moment, one that underscored just how far they had come in such a short time. The walls of prejudice that had once seemed insurmountable were crumbling, and in their place, a new foundation was being laid, one built on respect, understanding, and shared purpose. When the last council member had spoken, Marita turned to Johnson with a smile that was both warm and sincere. "Mr. Sterling, you've shown us that humanity is capable of greatness, of compassion, and of cooperation. You've proven that our differences can be a source of strength, not division. For that, we are grateful." Johnson felt a lump in his throat as he listened to Marita's words. This was what he had hoped for when he first set foot on Chlorophylia, an acknowledgement that humans were more than their worst moments, that they had something valuable to offer. And now, standing in this chamber, surrounded by those who had once doubted him, he knew that his efforts had not been in vain. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It means a great deal to me to hear that. But I want to make it clear that this is just the beginning. There's still so much we can do together, so much we can achieve. I'm committed to working alongside you to build a future where our species can thrive together." The council members nodded, their expressions filled with determination and resolve. It was clear that they, too, were committed to this new path, to the idea that cooperation between their species was not just possible, but necessary for their continued survival and prosperity. As the meeting drew to a close, Johnson found himself surrounded by the council members, each of them eager to express their gratitude and offer their support for the work that lay ahead. It was a far cry from the cold, clinical interactions he had experienced when he first arrived, and it filled him with a deep sense of satisfaction. As the last of the council members filed out of the chamber, Marita and Alita remained behind, their expressions reflecting the warmth and respect that had been so conspicuously absent in the early days of Johnson's mission. "You've come a long way," Johnson, Marita said, her voice filled with a rare note of affection. "I wasn't sure what to make of you at first, but you've proven yourself in ways I never could have imagined. You've earned our trust and our friendship." Johnson smiled, grateful for her words. "And you've earned mine, Dr. Marita. It's been an honor to work with you, and I look forward to what we'll accomplish together in the future." Alita, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward, her eyes bright with emotion. "You've changed a lot of minds, Johnson. Not just in the council, but in the city, in our society. People are talking about you, about what you've done, and it's changing the way they see humans. It's incredible." Johnson felt a surge of pride at her words, but he was quick to deflect the praise. "I couldn't have done it alone. You and Marita have been there every step of the way, and I'm grateful for that." Alita smiled, a soft blush coloring her olive-green cheeks. "Thank you, Johnson. I'm just glad I got to be a part of it." As they stood there, sharing a moment of quiet reflection, the door to the chamber opened once more. Johnson turned to see Lilith entering the room, her expression softer than he had ever seen it. There was a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a look of admiration and respect that filled Johnson with a deep sense of accomplishment. "Sterling," she said, her voice carrying a note of affection that was still new and unfamiliar, "I've been looking for you." Johnson smiled, meeting her gaze with equal warmth. "Lilith, I was just about to come find you." She walked over to him, her movements graceful and confident, and placed a hand on his arm. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice quiet but earnest. "For everything. You've done more than anyone could have asked, and I'm grateful." Johnson felt a wave of emotion wash over him at her words. Lilith had been his fiercest critic, the one who had doubted him most, and to hear her speak to him with such sincerity was a testament to just how far they had come. "Thank you, Lilith," he said softly, his voice filled with genuine emotion. "That means more to me than you know." She nodded, her hand still resting on his arm as she looked into his eyes. "I was wrong about you, Sterling. I'm not afraid to admit that. But I'm glad I was wrong. You've shown me and everyone else what humanity is truly capable of." Johnson smiled, his heart full as he met her gaze. "And you've shown me that there's more to chlorophilia than I ever could have imagined. I'm honored to be a part of this world." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of their shared experiences hanging in the air between them. It was a moment of connection, of understanding, of mutual respect, and perhaps something more. Finally, Lilith broke the silence, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We have a lot of work ahead of us, Sterling, but I'm looking forward to it, especially with you by my side." Johnson nodded, feeling a deep sense of contentment settle over him. "So am I, Lilith, so am I." As they turned to leave the chamber, walking side by side, Johnson couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The journey he had embarked on when he first set foot on chlorophilia had been fraught with challenges, with moments of doubt and fear, but it had also been filled with moments of triumph, of connection, of hope. He had come to this world as an outsider, but now as he walked through the grand hall, he felt like he belonged, like he was part of something greater than himself. The people of chlorophilia, who had once seen him as a threat, now looked at him with gratitude and respect. The walls of prejudice had been broken down, and in their place, new bridges were being built, bridges that would connect their worlds, their species, in ways that neither could have imagined. As they stepped out into the sunlight, the city spread out before them, vibrant and alive. Johnson felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what he had worked for, what he had fought for, a future where humans and chlorophilia natives could stand together as equals, as allies, as friends. And as he looked out over the city, hand in hand with Lilith, he knew that this was just the beginning. The path ahead was still uncertain, still filled with challenges, but for the first time he felt truly hopeful about what lay ahead. This was a new era, a time of reconciliation, of gratitude, of growth, and Johnson Sterling was ready to embrace it, to build a future where both their species could thrive together.